Welcome to the Standing in This Place podcast. I'm Rachel Carter and I'm the artist behind this project, supported by National Lottery project grants through Arts Council England. I'm going to be telling the historic tale of the intertwining of the lives of women working in the textile mills of the industrial Midlands and the enslaved women working the cotton fields in America. I'd like to welcome to the podcast my special guest, Dr Susanne Seymour from the University of Nottingham. Welcome, Susan.
Hello, Rachel. Nice to be here.
So we're going to talk about cotton in particular, but before we do, did you want to just give our listeners a little introduction about who you are and what you do at the University of Nottingham?
Yes, I'm a lecturer in the School of Geography at the University of Nottingham, and I work on cultural and historical geography. And one of my areas of interest is linkages, particularly linkages of Britain to transatlantic historical slavery, and a particular interest in how those linkages play out in rural areas. So I've done work on landed estates and on the rural cotton industry. And I also have a role in a cross-disciplinary institute at the university, the Institute for the Study of Slavery, and I'm deputy director at the moment of that institute.
Wow. Gosh, it all sounds like it keeps you very, very busy.
Yes.
So that leads us quite beautifully onto today's topic. So in episode 2 of the podcast, we discovered who was Arkwright, Strutt and Evans. And we discussed the new methods of industrialisation that swept across the Midlands that had impact on further afield. And the commonality, the common thread, was that they was all using the same material, cotton. So I really want to delve into the story of cotton and where did it come from, and under what circumstances was that grown. So as you've mentioned that you're part of the school that studies slavery, and we do know that a lot of cotton was grown and picked by enslaved hands. So do we know when this really started to sort of take off with this cotton production?
Well, cotton was a relatively new material for British industrialists to use. So my understanding is that in the early 18th century, there wasn't really much use of cotton, and it was used partly in combination with other materials. And then, when Arkwright and his colleagues sort of really started developing the factory-based cotton textile industry, that led to a much greater demand for raw cotton and cotton production in its own right. So that grew from the early 18th into the mid and later 18th centuries. And early on, there were supplies brought in from the Caribbean, from the West Indian colonies that Britain held in the Caribbean, and also other European countries. And from areas such as the area of modern day Turkey and the sort of the Near East sort of areas. So they were important. But by the time Arkwright and colleagues started up at Cromford in the early 1770s, there was beginning to be a shift towards deriving cotton much more strongly from these areas in the Americas where slavery-based systems of labor were dominant. So, and you can see there's evidence that the demand for cotton in Britain and in Britain's so-called industrial revolution helped drive the slave trade and the development of these slavery-based systems in the Americas.
Right. So we've got that big shift then from just using small amounts of cotton to larger amounts, and that demand and that fueling, more enslavement of people. And do we know what the life would have been like for somebody working on a cotton plantation?
So yes, I mean, we do have some particular studies which chart the experience of life on the plantation. But obviously, the enslaved people who were taken from Africa were enslaved. They weren't paid laborers. They weren't volunteering to work there. They had been captured, traded, and sold as like goods, like commodities.
Mm.
So they didn't have rights as workers. They they were, treated much more like, sadly, like animals than like people.
Yeah.
And so the conditions were terrible on any plantation with enslaved workers. And we know that typically they would work from very early in the morning in the fields to dusk, so from sunrise to dusk, with a break for lunch. Um, they would work under the direction of a so-called driver, who would typically have a whip to, you know, force people to labour in the fields. And we know that in the Americas, cotton is a semi-tropical crop. The weather conditions were, it's hot, humid weather. So people worked in the heat of the day and under the threat of the whip. And it was manual labour. It was hard manual labour, sowing, weeding, and then picking, and then processing cotton. This was a really tough labour regime. And for women who worked in the fields, and many women, the people who worked in the fields weren't just men. Women worked in the fields, in the cotton fields, and women worked even when they were pregnant or when they were nursing children. They would typically work in the fields, and they would take their children with them when they were very young. After sometimes a period when they were allowed not to work, they would go back and then work in the fields. And this made a double strain on women.
Yeah.
Child bearers, and they were workers.
Gosh, it's you just can't imagine the life that they were forced to live, and just that constant threat of the whip, and not feeling like your life is your own. And you sent me this quote from a lady called Mary Prince, and from History of Mary Prince, a West Indian slave. And in her words, she explained, "I was soon surrounded by strange men who examined and handled me in the same manner that a butcher would a calf or a lamb he was about to purchase, and who talked about my shape and size in like words, as if I could no more understand their meaning than the dumb beasts. I was then put up for sale." And she really paints that picture, doesn't she, of the degrading nature of being sold like an animal, to labor on the land for no reward.
Yes, it's a very powerful account that was published when Mary Prince came to Britain with her claimed owners. The people who claimed they owned her brought her to England, and she escaped from from being their enslaved servant, and went to the Anti-Slavery Society, and from that point her autobiography was drafted using her own words, and was published as part of the abolitionist campaign in Britain. And I think that extract is so powerful because it shows her experience of being treated as property, as like an animal, and really sort of shows up the savage cruelty of those who were doing that to her.
Yeah. So you mentioned the abolitionists and the anti-slave trade. So I've been looking at the Josiah Wedgwood anti-slavery medallion that has a man in shackles on a bended knee, and then the words, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And I understand that women in particular would adapt that medallion and wear it on their clothes as a way to signify to others that they were against slavery. And I think there was also tea sets as well with those messages within the images on the teapot. So as you're serving somebody a cup of tea, you could then pass that message on. So when did the abolition of slavery take place?
Okay, so the enslaved had always been pushing for the abolition of the institution that enslaved them. We have there's a long history of resistances, everyday resistances, and then more acute rebellions in the Atlantic world, including rebellions that took place on the ships as they crossed the Atlantic. But in Britain, abolitionist sentiment was there in the early 18th century, but it really sort of took off in the 1780s when campaigns were launched, in particular for abolition. And abolitionist societies were set up, particularly around abolition of the slave trade. And Britain then abolished its slave trade to its Caribbean and Atlantic world colonies in 1807. I think the Act was passed in 1806. So that was the abolition of the British slave trade, but not all slave trades were abolished at that time. So the Brazilian slave trade went on until the 1850s, for example. And Brazil was an important source of raw cotton for the Derbyshire mill owners, particularly from the 1790s until about 1820. It was a really important source of cotton for them. And we often overlook that the Southern American colonies, European colonies, were also places where enslaved labour was very prominent. But to get back to abolition, so we have abolition of the British slave trade, but then Britain later abolishes slavery in its own colonies in the Americas. So that happens with an act of 1833, and then there was a period of what was called sort of a period when people weren't totally free, but they weren't enslaved. So and it was really 1838 by the time people were made free from slavery. I would hesitate to say completely because it has its legacies, but that really marks the period when people had more control over their own lives.
Yeah.
So there's this period of so-called apprenticeship for about 4 years in most of the British colonies, and then they were released from that apprenticeship and able to earn wages.
So when we're looking at individuals such as Arkwright, Strutt and Evans, so after the abolition of the slave trade for Britain, so did they stop buying cotton from the Americas, knowing that it's picked by enslaved hands and under poor conditions?
Basically, no. And that would be characteristic of the whole of the British cotton manufacturing industry. There was very, very little attempt to buy free labour cotton. There were some moves in America led by black and white abolitionists to produce free labour cotton and to try and market it, but it had very limited impact. And so the places like the Derwent Valley were following a trend, a broader trend, that although many of the mill owners indicated some support for abolition, they were still sourcing the main bulk of their raw cotton from systems where slavery persisted. And after 1834, when Britain abolished slavery in its colonies, it still drew on that cotton from the southern states of America, and the southern states produced, they were the world leading area for cotton production at the time. And Britain, I think in the 1840s, 1850s, was importing about 80% of the raw cotton it used from those southern states.
Gosh.
So it was really drawing still on that enslaved labor, but outside its own colonies in the southern states of America, places like Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama.
Yeah. So I think this is a great place to take a little break, and we're going to hear a poem from George Burnett. He's a young writer with the Writing East Midlands group, and he said his poem is called In the Factory. He also said, I don't think it's particularly amazing, but I thought it fitted the project's theme around cotton production and protest. He adds, the general idea is that maintaining relationships and being happy in spite of oppression and bad working conditions is, in a way, a kind of protest.
I smiled at you the other day, a beaming grin of tooth decay, but looms were whirring, bosses loud, and smiling's really not allowed. Today the cotton's in my bones, my legs are weak, my chest it groans. I feel a hand, look up and see, you grin at me, I beam with glee.
George, I thought you summed that up so beautifully. So thank you so much for sending me your poem. So Susan, let's return to our theme. So we have the abolition of the slave trade in the UK. However, lots of cotton is still entering the UK, picked by enslaved hands in very poor conditions. And I wanted to touch on something you mentioned before about resistance and rebellion. And you shared with me this image of a simple cotton sack that was embroidered. And this was found quite recently, wasn't it?
Yes, I believe it was found someone saw it in a flea market in America and bought it, and then donated it to one of the American plantations, which has been rare in its sort of really honest attempts to try and tell the plantation story through the eyes of the enslaved. So it was donated to that plantation, and then they've donated it or lent it to the National African American Museum in the US.
Yeah. And could you tell us a little bit about, what is embroidered on the sack, the story?
Okay. So the person who found it was not a descendant of the person who made this sack. But as I understand it, what's happened is the ownership of the sack has been traced to a descendant, of the person who made it. And the story, as I understand it, is that during the American period of slavery, enslaved people who were bought and sold, and typically, families, parents and children were not kept together. And this is a story of a family, of a woman who was enslaved, who was separated. Her daughter was sold off the plantation that she was working on, that she was enslaved on. And the story is that she sent her young daughter away with this sack with some of her possessions in it, some of the things that her mother could give her, just a few things that she sent with her. And then the daughter kept that cotton sack, and it passed down. She was liberated. And it passed down to her children. And I think her granddaughter told the story that her grandmother told her and embroidered it on the sack. So just the story that her mother had given her this sack with, I think, 3 items in it, and this was embroidered on the sack. Just a basic cotton, you know, not a fancy sack. This is a working sack from a cotton plantation, but embroidered on there with the most precious words of a mother to her daughter, as her daughter was sold away from her as part of a system of slavery. And the granddaughter, I think, of the child who was sold away, embroidered on the sack, and it was like a part of that recording of the oral testimony of those who had experienced directly enslavement, kept in a very moving but simple form. And then somehow that got lost from that family and ended up in the market, and then was refound and has been reconnected with the family.
Gosh, it's such a simple item, a simple cotton sack with stitched words, but then the words carry such a lot of weight and meaning, and it's just amazing that this has survived and is now, you know, on show for people to come and experience themselves. So I think it's things like that and first-hand testimonies that really helps to sort of bring that period of history to life. So before we finish off, is there any places that you would recommend visiting in the UK that if people are interested to find out more, or is there any websites that you would recommend that they go and visit and have a look at?
Well, there are quite a few different places that you can go to find out more about the histories and testimonies of enslaved people. So the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool, it's a free museum and has, you know, a large amount of material dedicated to telling the histories of slavery internationally. And it has temporary exhibitions there as well, which focus on different things. So that's a really positive place to visit. More locally, you could go to the Derwent Valley Mills World Heritage Site, visitor centre at Cromford Mills, and see some of the work that has been done there through the Global Cotton Connections project and the Legacy Makers work, and see sort of there again some material about where cotton used in the valley came from, and also recorded material by the community volunteers who've worked on the histories and legacies of slavery in that area, and their sort of testimony and their experience of finding out about this history and why it's important to them that these histories are told in places like Cromford Mills. So that's a more local example. On the web, there's so much on the web that you can find out about. There's a really important resource called the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, which is I think the website is Slave Voyages, and that's this huge database of evidence about the transatlantic slave trade the ships involved, the people who financed the ships, the numbers of enslaved African people who were transported, who survived. And I think that's part of that is growing, is to record more testimonies, more personal sort of testimonies from the enslaved on that website as well. But that's a really, really important website. And then if you're interested in finding out more about the slave, the enslavers themselves, those who claimed ownership of people of African descent, then the Legacies of British Slave Ownership database, run by University College London, is a really powerful database, and that holds the information about all the individuals who claimed compensation when slavery was abolished in the British Atlantic colonies. So when Britain abolished slavery, it didn't give compensation to those who were enslaved. It gave compensation to those who had enslaved them. So again, that might be quite a shocking sort of point for people to grasp, but that's what happened. And there's this huge database of those who claimed for that compensation. And it just shows how it could be anyone from a sort of, a school teacher up into a merchant, or a rector in the Church of England, or a whole range of people, men and women, people who claimed ownership of just one or two enslaved people versus those who claimed ownership of tens of hundreds or even thousands.
Gosh. Well, thank you, Susan. I'll put some links on my website. We'll add those to the history pages. So if anybody listening wants to go and find out more, then just click on Standing in This Place and click history, and we'll put the links that Susan's pointed out on there, so you can find out lots more. So I just want to thank you, Susan, for being a guest on the podcast and giving us that brief overview about the links with cotton and the Midlands. So thank you very much, Susan.
Thanks, Rachel. It's been great to be involved with the project.
Over the coming months, the project will be developing, and there's lots of ways that you can get in touch and find out more. Just head to my website and click on the project page, Standing in This Place.